Biden and Trump in the same state tonight. Let's bring in, from Washington, D.C., Republican strategist Malik Abdul, and in Dallas, Texas Democratic strategist and NewsNation contributor Kurt Bardella to lay out their plans for victory. Guys, welcome back. Malik, I'm going to start with you. Trump versus Biden. We're here again, a rematch. What are the three things that Trump needs to do this time around?
First of all, Donald Trump actually needs to chart a path forward, even though what I was saying in the last segment, and I've been saying since then, is that Donald Trump trying to litigate 2020 will not move him forward into 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. So he needs to talk about what he plans to do. Of course, remind the country of remind voters of how much better it was when he was president. Obviously, Biden is going to make a different argument. Donald Trump also has to prosecute the case. And these is what I was talking about with those policies. Attack him on the border, attack him on his response to crime, attack him even on the economy, but don't underestimate Joe Biden, because that dark Brandon, geriatric Biden is a thing, but dark Brandon can indeed show up. And we saw that in the State of the Union speech. Whether or not Biden can do that consistently across a campaign season is another story. But Donald Trump also has to be more likable than Joe Biden. And that is his biggest problem. I'll continue to say that if Donald Trump doesn't do enough to move in a direction that makes him that same likable person that have people like Bill and Hillary Clinton showing up at his wedding, Donald Trump will lose. He can do it. We've seen him do it in the past. But Donald Trump, no voter will go to the polls saying, I really don't like this candidate, but I like this one even less, and I'll vote for him. Donald Trump needs to actually tackle that dynamic. And from what I hear, even privately, Donald Trump is a guy who can do that.
Okay, interesting. Kurt, same question for you when it comes to President Biden. What does he need to do?
Well, there are three things that I think President Biden's going to need to do if he's going to be successful in November. The first is keeping that coalition intact that he had, which really was about activating young voters. We had the most robust young voter turnout in the 2020 election. We had the largest turnout in American political history of all voters. This is going to be a contest about who can get who to vote, who can motivate their side to turn out people who voted in 2020, get them back in 2024. If he's able to do that, he wins. Biden needs to keep the women's issues front and center, keep Trump and the Republicans on the defensive. To this point, ever since Roe was overturned, Republicans have been underperforming, Democrats have been overperforming. Republicans still don't know politically how to address the abortion issue. In fact, they keep doubling down and making it even more extreme, as we've seen recently in Alabama with the IVF situation. That's something the president highlighted at the State of the Union address. That's going to be a primary issue, because if women show up and vote, and suburban white women particularly abandon the Republican Party, there is no path forward for Republicans to win if they lose that demographic big time. And I think the third is and it kind of speaks to what Malik was saying, Biden needs to bait Trump a little bit here. Let Trump beat Trump. Make sure he's off message. Make sure that he does those riffs and those rambles and goes into no man's land. The more that Trump talks about the past, the more that Trump relitigates the 2020 cycle, the more that Trump relitigates January 6th, the more he turns off independent swing voters that he's going to need in the swing states. So if Biden can kind of troll Trump a little bit here and get inside his head and get Trump to go off message and off the prompter, that's good for Joe Biden.
Kurt, you said something to us a few minutes ago that stuck in my head. The largest political action committees representing communities of color, AAPI Victory Fund. You mentioned what a huge demographic that is in Atlanta specifically, of course, around the country. The Latino Victory Fund is endorsing President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, also announcing a historic $30 million commitment to mobilize communities of color for the Biden-Harris ticket. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it just shows that, again, the coalition Joe Biden put together in 2020 was the largest, most diverse coalition we've ever seen in American political history. That is the key. That is the crux of him being successful in 2024. We've seen polling that shows that Biden's been slipping a little bit with the Latino vote, slipping a little bit with African Americans. If that trend is actually real and not just a snapshot of that, people are not enthusiastic about this race, which we know is kind of the reality. But if that's more than just a polling trend and becomes reality, that could spell trouble. This is going to be such a narrow election. This could be a close election, just like 2020 was. Neither side can afford to lose any percentage of the coalitions that they had in 2020.
especially with the race being so tight. We have that clip I mentioned before. The Biden campaign just released what's being described as a first campaign ad. I don't know if you guys saw it yet. I'm watching it for the first time. Let's talk about it on the other side.
Look, I'm not a young guy. That's no secret. But here's the deal. I understand how to get things done for the American people. I led the country through the COVID crisis. Today, we have the strongest economy in the world.
The first thing he brought up is his age. Malik, is this the right way to take on voters who are critical of the president's age?
Now, first of all, I know people talk about Beyonce behind me here, but I did not know Kurt's placement with the belt in the background.
I noticed that
Kurt,
too.
I did not notice that until now. You are the GOAT, man.
Hey, listen, before I let you get started, I'm in Dallas, Texas, where WWE SmackDown was last night with the return of The Rock, the most electrifying man in all of entertainment, paving the way to WrestleMania 40 in just a couple of weeks.
Loving that belt, Kurt. All right, Malik, let's go to that commercial.
Absolutely love it. Yeah, so it's a good commercial, and I think that Biden actually needs to address that. It is the elephant in the room for Biden, how he responds to this issue of age. So I thought that it was a nice ad. I don't think that COVID will be the issue that it was, even in the 2022 election cycle, because for the most part, people have dealt with that. We've moved on. But I thought that Biden struck the right tone here, especially after what many people argue was his more combative State of the Union, but I didn't even have a problem with that either. I'll give Joe Biden a pass here. It was a good one.
I want to bring up what Kurt said about those demographics. Specifically, we were talking about people of color, Malik. Now I want to talk about these latest polls we're seeing. They're post-Super Tuesday. For Trump, white evangelicals continue to be his strongest supporters. What do you make of this? Because this is also a demographic that really shows up in November.
Yeah. Conservative. That I think that they would be equally supportive of any president. Obviously, there's an affection that many have for Donald Trump. We saw this even in 2016, the question of whether or not the evangelicals will support Donald Trump. Many people would argue because of racism and all of these other things. But I think at the end of the day, they see that Donald Trump is a strong conservative who has delivered on many of those, the key issues that they find. It is a very, interesting dynamic because you have evangelicals in Donald Trump's life, even his personal life, and in many ways is antithetical to their issues, but they support him, again, I believe, on those conservative issues. And so they're willing to actually deal with his personal problems, that personal dislike, in favor of the policies that they support.
Malik and Kurt, guys, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.